Can't walk? Guess I'll have to ride.
You can't do that. You'd be the perfect target.
Garnett felt a very huge obligation to his men. And it was not only because of the bond and the affection that he had for his Virginians, but because he was commanding under a stigma, under a cloud. Because over a year prior, Garnett had been censured by Stonewall Jackson. He had been placed under arrest, for not meeting expectations, not carrying out orders, not moving quickly enough. Jackson's thinking was often sometimes sporadic in regard to the expectations of his generals. And but by this point, Garnett was back with his men. And I suppose you could make the argument that he was overcompensating. He felt that he needed to redeem himself from this shame that had been perhaps unjustly cast upon him by Stonewall Jackson. And that undoubtedly is one of the reasons why he opted to ride his horse into battle that day. These scenes of the Confederates stepping off and embarking on their march, and much of the footage that follows was filmed on the actual battleground. Not all of the scenes, but many of them. And for a lot of the reenactors who were participating, it was a rather emotional experience. It was an emotional experience for people standing on the sidelines. Because there were not many occasions since the battle where such a large formation of 19th century clad troops were marching across. And so indeed, this I think was one of the great lures of the film for reenactors. I mean, all these, thousands and thousands of extras who brought their own clothing and their equipment. They weren't paid for it. They did it as a pure passion project. And as I said in a previous segment, this film, and especially these scenes, could not have been done without them. Today, a lot of this would just be recreated with CGI. But really, I think by this point in filmmaking, CGI hadn't really quite reached that stage yet. And certainly this film did not have the budget to work with. And as I've said, I think it's one reason why the film has aged relatively well is because these are all practical effects. I mean, you think about another movie like Dunkirk, where it's all real people and real airplanes. The same is true here for Gettysburg. And none of it's going to look fake 20 or 30 years down the road because it's all real.
March!
And once again, this is the actual battleground. And so, just the scale of it, kind of being swept up with the music, it's just really impressive as far as the magnitude of it goes. I think Pickett's charge almost plays out in real time as far as the advance across these meadows go. The distance between the lines is slightly under a mile. And certainly in these moments of the film, that terrain and that width is permitted to kind of soak in the movie viewers. The traffic, the modern day traffic on the Emmitsburg Road was open as they were filming all of this, and quite naturally, as tourists and passers-by saw these masses of Confederate troops coming across, it did not take long for a huge number of cars to become backed up on the Emmitsburg Road to take in the scene. And indeed, quite a scene it must have been. And here, in this transition, this is not filmed in the park, because naturally monuments and markers and things like that would get in the way. These scenes are filmed not too far away from the park itself. And in fact, many subsequent Gettysburg reenactments have taken place on this same property in the years since. Here with General Pickett, this is a representation of the Cadore barn. This is not the actual one that we see here, but the real barn still stands alongside the Emmitsburg Road today, and it was from roughly this location where General Pickett watched his men proceed forward. And these are some of my favorite shots in the film. We see the Union soldiers crunched down behind the stone wall, their rifles loaded, their bayonets fixed, the ominous music playing in the background. And then it's followed by what in my mind is kind of the iconic shot of the movie, of the Confederates marching in slow motion and the red-hot shells going over them. It's just really well-filmed stuff. One of the great impediments for these Confederates was crossing the various fence lines amidst these pastures, and particularly the double fence line that ran parallel on both sides of the Emmitsburg Road. And as we can see here, it just became one massive bottleneck. By this point, Union gunners were firing canister shot. There's these massive shotgun blasts that sprayed, hot metal into these masses of men. Union defenders on Cemetery Ridge said that they could see this red mist hovering above the Emmitsburg Road as these Southern troops were just being eviscerated. Perhaps only a few hundred Confederates made it past the fence on the Emmitsburg Road, and possibly only a few dozen actually were able to break into the Union-held stone wall. I suspect human nature and inclination motivated many Confederates simply just to stay in the roadbed of the Emmitsburg Road, and I wouldn't blame any of them for thinking, I made it this far and I ain't going any further. Because death awaited people beyond that fence line, as some brave souls were soon to find out.
My God will fight. Damn it all.
What actually happened to General Hancock is that a bullet struck the pommel of his saddle, and it lodged one of the saddle nails into his groin. Something that he lived with embedded in him for a number of years, I believed. And then sometime later, a doctor who finally was trying to ease his pain had him actually sit on top of a saddle. And when he did that, the saddle nail plopped right out. The death of this young artillery lieutenant here is Alonzo Cushing. Wounded 4 times, his final wound shot through the open mouth as he is yelling out orders to his men. And in 2014, he became the most recent Battle of Gettysburg veteran to posthumously receive the Medal of Honor. Garnett's remains were never found, although curiously, a number of years later, his sword was found in a Baltimore pawn shop. So it'd be interesting to find out how it ended up there.
With me! Who will come with me?
And in this moment, we have another really good cameo by the executive producer, and that is media mogul Ted Turner, who financed the $25 million in order to make Gettysburg. And Turner plays a Confederate colonel by the name of Waller Patton. And Waller Patton was the uncle of World War II General George S. Patton. And Waller's brother, also named George, would be killed a year later at the Battle of Winchester in Virginia. And so it's a very multi-layered approach here in regard to the number of famous names associated with this family. At the time of this production, Ted Turner was married to Jane Fonda. And when Jane Fonda came to visit the set, that was something that many of the reenactors, some of whom were Vietnam War veterans, were not very appreciative of. So another interesting little production note there. Par for the course, a number of reenactors have told me that this filming was not safe. This was not a safe set. These reenactors are shooting black powder at each other only feet apart. Most of them still have their real bayonets affixed to their rifles. A lot of guys got black eyes, bloody noses, got pretty banged up here as they were recreating all of this. The artillery sergeant who we see here firing, rounds of double canister at the angle in the stone wall was a sergeant by the name of Frederick Fugger, who, like his lieutenant Alonzo Cushing, will receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. And in fact, I know the reenactor who portrays Sergeant Fugger in this film, a former colleague of mine from the National Park Service, and he was highly involved in the making of this film. And so I often think of my very good friend here as he's firing double canister into the oncoming rebels. They even have in these scenes of this hand-to-hand combat, they even have the placement of the sun correct. The sun is at their backs in most of these shots, it's just so well done. But you can see here in this scene, you can certainly get a sense of the danger, not only for the real-life people, but the actors who were recreating it. I mean, it's they just threw everybody into a big heap here, and it by and large works. General Armistead was actually shot twice, once in the arm and once in the leg, and no doubt they upgraded his wound in the film, having him shot in the chest, to kind of add an exclamation point onto the fact that this guy's probably not going to survive.
Break him low.
Stephen Lang falling off his horse here, it was not something that was planned. It happened by accident. His horse was scared by some of the squibs going off in the ground, and they decided to keep it in the film. There are also a number of historian cameos. We can see one of the men here hoisting General Kemper. Was then director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. An immigrant historian who was fascinated by Lincoln, a gentleman by the name of Gabor Boret. And so he's one of many Civil War historians who makes a brief appearance in this film. He ends up dying, though, much like Ted Turner does. I love this shot. The flag still waves. As we see these streams of wounded coming back, it's important to note that there are about 13,000 Confederates that participated in Longstreet's assault, and half of them would be killed, wounded, or captured. A ghastly toll.
Sir, could you tell me what your name is? Who you are?
I would like to speak to General Hancock. Do you know?
General Armistead was comforted by a young lieutenant, as we see depicted here, but it was not Thomas Chamberlain, because as we earlier said, the 20th Maine wasn't anywhere near here. That young lieutenant was actually an officer by the name of Henry Bingham. Both Bingham and Armistead were Freemasons. The story goes that Armistead perhaps gave the sign of distress known among Masons, and Bingham came to his aid as a result. Armistead gave Bingham his pocket watch, and he asked that that watch be handed over to his old friend, who was only a few yards away and who himself was wounded. But as Armistead had hoped, he would never see his friend again. He dies of his wounds 2 days later at the Spangler farm. We see Union soldiers chanting Fredericksburg, and like I referenced earlier, these soldiers saw this moment as payback. That their defeat at Fredericksburg, where the Confederates were behind the stone wall, had been reciprocated. It had been avenged. And undoubtedly there was a high degree of satisfaction among many Union soldiers as they saw that Confederate retreat across those open fields.
I'll tell you plain. There are times when you worry me. No good trying to get yourself killed, General. The Lord come for you in his own good time.
Like Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet sometimes did have the tendency of moving too far forward. And later on, he would end up losing the use of his arm as a result that he would sustain. Civil War generals had a high casualty rate, especially in comparison to generals of today. And generals today are sometimes in other countries as they direct battles. Here in the Civil War, and with Victorian sensibilities, with what they were, a sense of chivalry perhaps, there was very much the mentality that these people had to lead from the front.
I do hope you are not seriously injured, sir.
They tell me that it's mortal, General.
General Kemper did survive his wounds, unlike his two fellow brigade commanders in Pickett's division. And like many Civil War veterans following the conflict, he used his wartime heroics to bolster his political career. And after the war, he became the governor of Virginia. The instance in which General Lee famously says, "It is all my fault," has come to represent what people perceive as his humility, his nature as a gentleman. But, in more recent years, this story and this quote has become a bit circumspect. Because, by and large, accounts of him saying this don't pop up until many years afterward in a lot of the historiography of the Civil War. And, it begs the question, did he actually say this, or is this something that somebody fabricated years later to try to make him sound even greater than what he was as a human being, perhaps?
General Lee, I have no division.
Oh, great cinematography in line here. Powerful. George Pickett was very resentful of Robert E. Lee for the rest of his life. And at a later point, after the war, Pickett encountered Lee in a street. And they shared some sort of small courtesy. And Pickett turned to another Confederate leader who was walking beside him, John Mosby. And Pickett said, "That old man had my division slaughtered." To which Mosby replied, "Yes, George, but he made you immortal."
We will withdraw as soon as we have secured all those wounded.
I enjoy this humble little scene because it really demonstrates the burden of command. It shows that, you know, these heroic figures are vulnerable human beings. And, producer Ted Turner, he intended this film to be an anti-war film. And, he said in one interview that, that this movie, he hoped, would be another nail in the coffin for people's desires to have military conflicts. And he says, we must make war a thing of the past. And so that was one of his kind of ideological agendas in making this film. And I think the weight of such thoughts really comes to the surface in very well-acted scenes like this. Oh, this cinematography at the end is so stunning. Perfect silhouette shots. Witnesses to the carnage following the battle, one eyewitness said it was like a vast sea of misery. And for the people who lived in Gettysburg, that misery went on for months and months and months, sometimes even years, as they tried to rebuild their lives. Some viewers think that this brotherly embrace of the Chamberlain brothers, who once again were nowhere near this spot at the end of July 3rd, is a little bit hokey, perhaps a little bit over the top, but I have a younger brother as well, and I think if I had survived the largest battle to be fought in the Western Hemisphere and we both made it out, I would probably give him a hug. Much like the opening titles, I think the coda here, with the flash between the actors and the people they are portraying, sums things up quite nicely. I really enjoy it when historical movies do this because I think it's very significant that we put a face to these real-life people. Chamberlain wrote a number of memoirs and articles, and he embellished a few things in the years after the war, and some of those embellishments became part of the book and the film thereafter. But you cannot deny the heroism of this man. Wounded 6 times, almost died, lived with the pain of his wounds for another half a century. Just this large, noble figure of Civil War history. And of course, because the film was shot on actual locations, that's just one of my favorite things about the movie. So with that, we've made it. We've sat through the longest American movie ever made. And despite that, I just still really enjoy this movie. I enjoy it almost as much as I did when I first saw it when I was in grade school. And I think you could argue that I'm guilty of a little bit of sentimentality toward it. But hopefully that has not hindered my historical view as I convey some of the finer points of the movie to both you and my students in the classroom. I think the film is valuable because it did a lot of things. It jump-started the hobby of historical reenacting. It led a lot of people to become involved in historical preservation. The visitation of Gettysburg National Military Park the year after this movie came out jumped by over 100,000, myself included, among those numbers. And it sparked the imagination and piqued the interest of an up-and-coming generation of historians. And likewise, I'm included in that as well. And so despite some of its historical flaws, embellishments, exaggerations, a little bit of lost cause nostalgia, I still think that Gettysburg has aged quite well. I still think that portions of it are very valuable for classroom use, and it is an important addition in the cinematic canon of Civil War movies. Before we go, as we often do, I'd like to make some additional recommendations for you as far as reading goes. One of my absolute favorite accounts of Longstreet's assault on July 3rd is George Stewart's book called Pickett's Charge. George Stewart was a novelist, and he wrote a lot of really great science fiction novels as well, but as a result, his writing is very accessible. It is very dramatic. And so if you're interested in learning more about this ill-fated Confederate assault, I would definitely check out Pickett's Charge. Another book that we have lined up that I assign every semester in my Pennsylvania history class is a book called The Colors of Courage by Margaret Crichton. And I think one could make the argument that the story featured in this book is the one not shown in the movie Gettysburg. We get a really intimate account of Gettysburg's civilians, African-American population, immigrant soldiers who were fighting in the Battle of Gettysburg, and it offers a very different perspective from the typically male-dominated story that we see in other books and in other cinematic depictions of the American Civil War. So this is a really good one. And then, of course, if you are interested in learning more about the more contemporary history of Gettysburg National Military Park, including the filming of this movie within the park boundaries, I recommend my book, Images of Modern America, Gettysburg National Military Park. This is a smaller and humble visual testament to how the Gettysburg battlefield has changed since the 1950s. And I have some photos and anecdotes from the making of the movie Gettysburg within this book. So here too, something a little bit different in contrast to the usual Civil War battlefield book. That wraps up everything for this episode of Real History. Join us next time as we continue to separate fact from fiction in our various cinematic journeys. We look forward to seeing you then.